Between the years 320 and 330, Eusebius wrote his Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius is generally regarded as the first church historian. And said that the church recognized 22 of the books and letters that we presently have in our New Testament. There were 5 that are presently in our New Testament that he said the church at that point regarded as doubtful. This would be James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John. Again, he regarded these as doubtful because they doubted whether the authors actually wrote these. In fact, even in modern scholarship, even in some evangelical scholarship, there is still serious question over whether James, Jude, Peter, and John actually wrote these. Debates take place even today over these. Although it may not be debated whether they should be included in the canon or in the New Testament, they still debate over the authorship of these. But this debate goes all the way back to Eusebius. Cyril of Jerusalem in the year 350, it said the church approved of 27 at that point, many did. Now, it wasn't the same 27 we have today. 26 of the 27 were there, but he also wanted to include the Gospel of Thomas. And as far as I know, he's the only one who ever wanted to include the Gospel of Thomas. This was the only time it was. Cyril excluded, he excluded Revelation because he didn't think John wrote it. The Laodicea Synod of 363 recognized 26 of the 27 that we have today. Thomas is out at this point. It was only in that one time. Thomas is out, you have all 26, but Cyril went ahead and the Laodicea Synod excluded the book of Revelation. Athanasius of 367 is the first one to come along and say, at this point, the church recognized 27 books and letters in the New Testament, and this is the first time we have the 27 recognized that we have today in our New Testament. Then Gregory of Nazianzus in 390 recognized the same 27. The African canons of 393 to 419 recognized the 27 that we have today. And then you have Jerome of 394, the 27 that we have today. Augustine in 395 to 400 recognized the 27 that we have today. The Carthage Synod of 397 recognized 26. They still had their serious questions about Revelation and whether John wrote it, and so they excluded it from their canon. But when the Carthage Synod met again in the year 419, they brought it back. And they said, we thought about it again, and we think Revelation should be in there. And then from that point on, there still was some dispute, but the 27 continued to be accepted and accepted. The point I want to make here is that the tendency was to exclude literature from the New Testament. It wasn't a matter, hey, let's include all these, and then over time it's just let's throw out some of these that don't agree. They might even agree that Revelation and 2nd and 3rd John and 2nd Peter and Jude and James were orthodox in their teachings, widespread in usage, etc. But maybe they didn't think that they were accepted by or written by an apostle or their colleague, and so they debated over these things and went to exclude them from the canon. Again, over time, they started to include these in, but it was after significant debate that took place over centuries. I mentioned Hebrews a little bit earlier. Was it written by Paul? Well, there was debate over this, as you can see. Eusebius said, perhaps. Cyril, yes. Athanasius, yes. Gregory, yes. The African canons, no. Jerome, yes. Augustine, yes. The Laodicea Synod, yes. The Carthage Synod, both of them said no. Now, what's interesting is even though they said no, they still included it in the canon because they would have thought that it was probably, penned by one of Paul's colleagues, a colleague of an apostle. Today, we still don't know who wrote Hebrews. In fact, Origen, in the 3rd century, one of the church fathers said, who wrote the letter of Hebrews? In truth, God knows. So again, what's interesting is even the ancients, even though they didn't know who wrote it, they were still wanting to include it within the canon. So written by an apostle wasn't the only criteria that they used. Today, there's still debate over the authorship of a lot of these letters. For example, over the 13 letters in the New Testament we have from Paul. 7 of them are almost universally regarded as being written by Paul. 6 of them are in question. 3 of them are in serious question. And I mentioned those would be 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. But still, a lot of people would include these in our New Testament because if they weren't written by Paul, they may have been written by one of his colleagues, or they contained Pauline thought. They were widespread usage in the early church. You know, there are a lot of things that we could consider as we look at these, and other questions will pop up. Why don't we have 1st Clement or Polycarp's letter to the church at Philippi? Because these were written by colleagues of the apostles, Peter and John, respectively. Or what if some people were digging around, archaeologists were digging around in Jerusalem, and they uncovered one of Paul's lost letters. In one of his letters, Paul mentions the letter that he wrote to the church of Laodicea, and yet we don't have such a letter. What happened to it? Well, it appears that it may have been lost. In that case, what if they found it? And what if in that letter Paul said, hey, I understand that some of you were reading my letter that had been passed on you that I wrote to the church at Rome, and you got a little bit anxious and debates arose what I meant about predestination and election. And so I want to answer some of these questions for you in this letter. Well, that would certainly be relevant to the church to talk about election given the current debates over Calvinism. It would be relevant to the church, and it would be of interest, and if we could establish through grammatical analyses that this was written by the Apostle Paul, we would have to open up the question of whether we should include it in the canon. So this is kind of interesting to discuss these things. I don't know that such a letter like that is forthcoming, but we can see that the process of canonicity was a little bit fuzzy, maybe a little fuzzier than some of us may like at times. We like things very solid and laid out for us and very precise. But what we have today still may be regarded as authoritative for the Christian, and we still regard them as divinely inspired. That, in essence, is how the New Testament has come down to us today. Oh, before we go, I have one more slide to show you that I think will set some of this, will make sense. I want to show you a target here and how this kind of plays out. Now, in our bullseye, we have the literature which was always undisputed in the early church. Everyone accepted this. That'd be the 4 Gospels, Acts, 10 of 13 of Paul's letters, 1 John and 1 Peter. The church always accepted these as being apostolic and in the canon. Outside of that, you have Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, Jude, 2nd and 3rd John, Revelation, and 3 of Paul's letters. I mentioned those earlier. That would be 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These were debated for a while. Eventually, they became included into the canon, but they were considered doubtful for some time. Outside of that, you have 1 Clement, the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the letter of Polycarp to the church at Philippi, the Gospel of Thomas, Ignatius' letters, and the letter of Barnabas. The letter of Barnabas not to be confused with the spurious Gospel of Barnabas, which was probably a 14th, 15th century Muslim forgery, as most scholars would believe today, and for very good reason. So that Gospel of Barnabas is entirely different from the letter of Barnabas, which was probably penned at the end of the 1st century, but I don't know of any scholars who would say it was actually penned by the Apostle Barnabas. These that I just mentioned on that outer circle, they were, except the Gospel of Thomas, they were never thought to be included in the canon. They were used and considered as very, very valuable, and still are by most people, but just not part of the divinely inspired canon. And then on the outside, you got the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of the Egyptians, Gospel of Philip, the Acts of Paul, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, and many others that we could talk about in there. And these just were never even considered by anyone, not even the Gnostics or the others who revered them. They weren't considered as something that should be included in the canon. So this kind of gives you a snapshot of how that all kind of panned out.